All right, we're gonna go ahead and get going. A couple reminders. Number one is next week, we're gonna be back on Friday, so normal time. Back to normal schedule next week. There is also another journal club thing going on next week. Flash Journal Club is next Tuesday. Those of you who are presenting in that should already know you've been invited weeks ago and caught up with and all that stuff. So let me know if there's any issues there. But Flash Journal Club is also open to anyone who wants to attend, even if you're not presenting. So if you do just want to sit in and attend and check it out, let me know. And we'll make it happen. We'll get you scheduled in one of the rooms. Otherwise, I'm going to let Michael go ahead and get going. And we've also got Madison Owens presenting today as well.
Hey, everybody. Can you guys hear me pretty good? Okay. I'm Mike. I'm in the OHP program, and today I'm going to be presenting Meeting Madness, Counterproductive Meeting Behaviors and Personality Traits by Jorger et al., published in the International Journal of Management Practice. So I'll just get the ChatGPT thing out of the way. I asked ChatGPT to spit out a haiku based off of the article, and it said, wheels spin, time slips by, talking but no end in sight. Email would have worked, which I thought was kind of funny. Oh. A little bit. Well, a lot of it, actually.
Try fucking throw it a little bit.
Oh. There we go. Okay, cool. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a real brief video of a dysfunctional meeting. I want you to try to watch for counterproductive meeting behaviors as you might see them. So I'll go ahead and get started.
Okay, listen, guys, thanks. Excuse me, just for a minute. Just for a minute, so you know what this is about. Thanks for coming down here today because we've got to discuss.
We got to hurry up.
Got to discuss our grant that we just got. It's on technology, and we're getting $300 a student for next year, and $250 a student for the year after, and then it goes down to $150. But what's key is, you guys, it's based on enrollment.
Didn't your friend tell you there was going to be more money than that?
Yeah, I thought he said $450 a student. I have friends that work at
Enrollment's my expertise. I'll take care of that. Don't worry
Okay.
about it. I'm
Enroll-
to get to the kids.
All right, so the issue is we have to decide
It was one of them
today
Chinese parties.
how,
I have a
okay,
few of them.
all right, hold on a second.
I'd like to interject, please.
Okay, but hold on a second, all right?
Mr. Milliken?
Paul mentioned that he was the technology guru. And
That's what I
so,
thought.
yeah, and so that
That's so true.
probably not.
What?
He wants to take charge of this, but I'm kind of questionable because of the money amount. Where he's going to allocate that money.
Plus all he wants is Apple. So I mean that's because
Have to be open.
apples are the best computers. There's no
Yeah,
comparison.
yeah. There's
Don't you
no
agree?
question. There's no question. Anyone who thinks otherwise needs to check out from the neck up.
What time is the Kings game tonight? Can you look it up? Look it up.
Yeah,
Look
right?
it up.
I think I got it.
All right, listen, block of money.
So they're gonna share iPads?
Okay. Sorry, I tried stopping it. But, so what did you guys notice about that video in terms of counterproductive meeting behaviors? Right. It's a really good one. Chaos. That's really good. That's exactly what it is. It's all
Because we have to just,
chaotic
More money than that?
stuff. Let me get past this. You know, I've practiced this like 6 times and it worked every time. Every single time.
True. And
That's
so
right.
Go, help me out here. Okay, there we go. There we go. I think it works right when you got it. Perfect. Okay. So now we got the technical stuff out of the way. Yeah, that's really great. That's a really good example of what counterproductive meeting behaviors are. But let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about why it's important to study workplace meetings to begin with. There are varying statistics regarding how often meetings happen in the United States. But this particular article referenced the 2015 Allen et al. Article that said that there were 25 million of them happening each year. So that's a lot, or each day, not each year, sorry. And that's a lot. That means that meetings are pretty integral to how organizations function. So and then let's talk a little bit about why what happens when meetings aren't effective. So when meetings aren't effective, it leads to frustration. It leads to reduced meeting effectiveness, obviously, and then also it sets up the organization to be less productive, and it ultimately could lower the employees' morale. And then something else that I wanted to bring up really quick about meeting effectiveness is that this is kind of a common thing throughout the meeting literature, but people generally rate meetings at 50% poor. Like 50% of the meetings they attend are poor, not regular, not just like a little bit below average, but like absolutely poor. And that's a pretty big deal in terms of getting organizations to function effectively. And we'll talk a little bit more here in a few slides about what counterproductive meeting behaviors are. But in the general sense, counterproductive meeting behaviors are behaviors that meeting participants do that inhibit the flow and productivity of the actual meeting. So what did this study look for? It looked for three things. It looked to find out what the impact of counterproductive meeting behaviors was on meeting effectiveness. It wanted to find out what the moderating influence of personality traits was on that relationship. And there's been a couple of times I've sat on that side of the podium and I thought, what's moderating? So I looked it up. Moderating is when a variable affects the strength and intensity of a relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. In this case, they were looking at personality being that moderating variable for the independent variable, which was counterproductive meeting behaviors, and meeting effectiveness, which was the dependent variable. And then they wanted to know what specific personality traits affected meeting effectiveness the most. So the theoretical framework for this study was based out of trait theory. Was grounded in trait theory, which is basically suggests in a nutshell that individual personality trait differences can be responsible for influencing how people perceive and react to various situations. We'll go over what each one of these means, just in the real general sense. And again, there's a lot of different interpretations for what each trait is, but in the general sense, openness indicates how cooperative somebody is, how compassionate they are, even how friendly they are. Conscientiousness is a trait that probably more than a couple of people in this room probably have. You don't get to the graduate level without being disciplined, organized, and goal-oriented. Extroverted people, these are your folks in the meetings who, just in general life, who are outgoing, social. They're a little bit more dominating, again, in the general sense. And then folks who are agreeable, who are high in agreeableness, these guys, they really value group harmony, group cohesion, and that sort of thing. And then the last one is neuroticism. Folks who are neurotic, and this term is interchangeable with emotional stability, but folks who are neurotic generally experience anger more frequently, moodiness, and just unstable emotions. All right, let's talk a little bit about counterproductive meeting behavior. So we talked a little bit about what they were. We saw some examples in the video. Basically, when a meeting is when a counterproductive meeting behavior happens, it creates a self-perpetuating cyclic situation where some people, where it'll happen once, and then it'll happen again, and then it keeps happening until the meeting becomes entirely dysfunctional, or until even going to go past that and make the culture at the organization dysfunctional. Okay, so the methodology, and I used ChatGPT for that picture too. The methodology that they used in this study was they got a sample size of 274 individuals based in the United States from a program called MTurk, which is an online survey program. I don't know too much about it. It's just what I had heard it was. In terms of measurement tools, they used surveys to measure counterproductive meeting behaviors, meeting effectiveness, and then they did a personality trait assessment. And then finally, they did their data analysis with hierarchical regression, which is one I had to look this one up too because I'd never heard of it. But hierarchical regression analysis is is a common statistical method used to examine the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. It's important. It's unique because it considers the order at which the variables were put into the analysis. So we'll talk about hypothesis 1 first. They had thought that counterproductive meeting behaviors would be negatively related to perceived meeting effectiveness. And what that means is the more counterproductive meeting behaviors that a meeting participant was exposed to, the lower they would view the meeting as being effective. And the first sets of variables that they put in were job level, tenure, and gender. And the results that they got were, for that part, were an R squared of 0.06 with a p-value of 0.001. That means that when you put in those specific variables, it accounts for 6% of the variance, or those variables would be responsible for that relationship. And then the p-value represents that that the probability of getting that result is less than 1/10% by random chance. And then after that, they put in counterproductive meeting behaviors. They got an R squared of 0.18, which shows a lot more significant variance. And then the beta value of a negative 0.44. And a beta value is just a slope, which describes the intensity of the relationship between two variables, an independent variable and a dependent variable. In this case, this beta value demonstrates a moderate relationship, a moderate negative relationship. So the more counterproductive meeting behaviors there were, the less the meeting attendees perceived the meeting to be effective. And again, that was at a 0.001 p-value. I really tried hard when I came up with this PowerPoint presentation not to put too much on one slide, so it wasn't too much to digest. But in this case, I threw these two on here, so we'll kind of go through these as carefully as we can. This first one here, demonstrates the relationship between folks who are high in agreeableness and folks who are low in agreeableness. On the vertical axis, we have meeting effectiveness, and on the horizontal axis, we have low to high counterproductive meeting behaviors. And what this graph tells us is that folks who are low in agreeableness benefit more from having lower counterproductive meeting behaviors. The researchers postulated the fact that it was possible that folks who are high in agreeableness, because they value social harmony and group cohesion more, that would be a potential reason. And if we move over to the next graph over here, we have this one looks at extroversion. And alternatively to the high agreeableness, we had folks who are low in agreeableness actually were more affected by counterproductive meeting behaviors than folks who are high in agreeableness. The reason for that was because they felt like folks who were low in extroversion were more impacted by external events, and that created some dysfunction as a result. Now we'll talk about the non-significant findings. So remember, there are 5 dimensions to the big 5. We've covered extroversion and we've covered agreeableness. So we'll just talk about conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness. And the reason why these didn't show significant findings. One of the things that they brought up in that study was that these folks, when you look at these dimensions of those folks, the issue becomes they're more internally focused than externally focused. And when that happens, they're less affected by things on the outside. Now, this is just a, real quick cross-sectional study with some folks online. So that doesn't mean that you could find good or positive results or significant results in another study. It just means that they didn't in this one. So let's talk a little bit about the practical applications that they discussed in the study. I mean, it's no like surprise. They use personality assessments in organizations already, but this really just reinforces the idea that using personality assessments could be important for creating teams. When leaders come together or when leaders assess team composition based off of their individual employees' personality characteristics, they stand to make better choices. They stand to make better assignment decisions. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about training managers specifically to handle counterproductive eating behaviors. I think it really, and this happens in a lot of organizational dynamics. It's really up to the leaders to make those important decisions in a way so that they can prevent counterproductive meeting behaviors from happening. I really tried hard not to put CMBs up there so you guys didn't get confused, but I'm gonna have to say it so many dang times. Counterproductive meeting behaviors from happening, and then also mitigating them once they happen. So if you're in a meeting and then counterproductive meeting behaviors start, then you want to be able to nip them in the bud before they become an issue. And then in terms of limitations, again, this is a cross-sectional study design. So as with all cross-sectional study designs, it's difficult to, I don't know that you can establish temporality or causality as a result. And then also there was a cultural bias. I mean, all the participants were taken from the US, the samples entirely from the United States. So you really can't generalize the results of this study to say, a different country or a different region or a different area. And then finally, self-reporting, the fact that all these participants were self-reporting, that can create a whole slew of other biases, such as, social desirability biases, one that comes to mind. Although, I mean, because it was, an online thing, they weren't exposed to the actual researchers. Maybe they didn't really care, but it's hard to know that because I don't know all the details of this study. And then lastly, future directions. I'm really interested in this field. I like the idea of counterproductive meeting behaviors, and I plan on potentially going down that road with my dissertation at some point. And some of the ideas that they came up with in the research study were kind of interesting. They had mentioned potentially doing an experimental design to improve internal validity, including expectations of counterproductive meeting behaviors as a variable, and then finally, and this is my favorite, shifting personality to being a predictor of counterproductive meeting behaviors instead of a moderator. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
I have comments.
Sure.
So Mechanical Turk, it's a platform that's owned by Amazon, and it's not exclusively surveys. It's kind of micro task work. A big one on there for a long time was like captioning images, right? And then all of that data got fed into all these AI models that we're all talking about today. So really, like, a lot of the AI revolution was born on Mechanical Turk. But point is people go on this thing to earn extra money, right? So while there's they cite some studies saying that the population of these Mechanical Turk workers are representative of the national average, are there ways that are not captured in their demographic characteristics that this population might differ from the wider population, specifically with respect to their work life and maybe their experience of meetings? And that's an open floor question.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I guess it introduces some bias just in the aspect that they're getting paid in some way for it. that's one thing. And then if it's all entirely online, there's going to be a different type of people that respond to those sorts of things than say people who don't.
And the pay issue, I'm personally less concerned about that, but also in economics, it's really normal for experimental economists to pay their subjects, like it's actually expected, because you can't elicit economic behavior without stakes. But the bigger concern that I have when I see studies that rely heavily on like the mechanical Turk-based sample is from my own work, like platform workers generally don't have the best relationship with work. A lot of them are underemployed, or they're doing really low wage work in the primary labor market, and they're supplementing that with the secondary labor market work, right? And so, not puzzling out how that might filter in meetings, but it's generally you're not having a great experience in your normal working life, that might change the way you perceive the things you do at work.
Good point.
Just a quick related comment, the job level average is just less than 2, and 2 is a supervisor. So most of the people reporting these meetings are, as described, they're lower level, some supervisors, but mostly line employees.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So it's a study of a particular type of workforce that is probably knowledge-based and mostly employees with few supervisors.
Oh, that's very specific. Yeah. Yeah. No, that could influence the results for sure. Bubba?
You've got a couple comments online.
Yeah.
Daniel asks that is it likely that people said they were one personality trait, but based on the meeting, they might react or act differently? And then Troy had a similar question along the same lines, wondering if there are any validated personality tests. So kind of getting into personality traits issues.
Sure. I know that there are a couple of different ways to assess personality. I'm not entirely sure what they all are. I know that the Big Five was one, Myers-Briggs was another. But in terms of the first part of the question, I'm not sure. I think that when it comes to trait theory, at least from what my memory is, personality traits are stable over time. So, and maybe that changes, situationally, I'm not sure, but I just don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
So personality is one of the most longest studied concepts and within psychology. The Big Five are the result of hundreds of tests that were developed over the last 100 years that were then compiled in a variety of ways through meta-analyses and other processes. And as they did that and they reanalyzed the data over and over and over again, these 5 factors emerged. Now we labeled them these five things, but it is by far the most consistent finding, maybe in the entire area of psychology, personality. Now, in terms of measurement, there are good measures and there are terrible measures. Okay, Myers-Briggs is a terrible measure. Okay, what they do have is a really good marketing team. Okay, but what they don't have is a very good measure, at least for the variety of things that people use it for. If you want to just understand yourself and maybe how you feel about various things, it can be helpful in that regard. But for all the wonderful things that they say they can also do, it is garbage. The NEO-PIR is a good, I think it's a publicly available measure. I don't think you have to pay for that one. Is a good measure of the Big Five. There's a bunch of other good validated measures of the Big Five out there that people use all the time. And so that's one aspect of this study that I think is solid. I think the bigger issue, I think, is the sample, right? Issue, but it's an evolving issue, right? When this data was collected, which is not that many years ago, MTurk was actually a representative. People were on MTurk. Now there's concerns that MTurk might be populated primarily by bots, which is probably true to some degree, right? And so what happens is sometimes the now situation of that particular platform influences our interpretation of the previous historical data that was collected years ago. So to some degree that undermines the value of this study. But those are just a couple of things. But yeah, personality is one thing that psychology actually you know, because they've been doing it for a while, done pretty good.
Thanks.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I heard basically that one could use psychology and personalities to somehow manage meetings. And have you thought about how that would work and if that would work?
Yeah, I don't know. I hadn't really considered like a systematic way of approaching it. I was more just talking about like maybe in the more like individual sense, like if you're a leader and you're creating teams or managing meetings and you know that your one specific employee maybe is a little bit more extroverted than somebody else, maybe put them in a position of leadership within the team, maybe that sort of thing. That was just my initial like brief thought about it.
I think this is a good thought. I'm trying to pull out the application side of this.
Sure.
And I think that there are some, but Joe wants to jump in on this, but I think there are some elements of that. And there's also the somebody who's better at corralling the crazies, you know, and every organization has a few of those. So if you have a corraller, you know, you put them in that group that in terms of group management. So Joe wants.
So I mean, I have a follow-up question related to this, because we have a very interdisciplinary audience, both in the room and online. If I'm an industrial hygienist or an occupational injury prevention person or an occupational medicine, you know, physician, why should I care about this study at all?
It's a great question. Yeah, so I tried to touch on that as best I could in the practical applications, and I realize now thinking about it, it might be a little bit weaker in terms of that. But I think really what it boils down to is organizations care about counterproductive meeting behaviors in general because they inhibit meeting effectiveness, and they keep the organizations from doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is to make money. And a lot of the literature, a lot of the research backs this up. You know, when you take care of your employees or when you manage them the way that they need to be managed based off their personality and their abilities, then you put the organization in the best possible position to make money.
Yeah, so one thing I would add to that is, I think, you know, Dr. Hegman and other occupational medicine physicians would probably speak to this. If you have a care team for a patient who can't communicate effectively in a meeting environment, it's harder to deliver care for that patient. It's not impossible, but it's harder. So what happens in these environments is that you have suboptimal decision making, suboptimal outcomes from the meeting. And so if there's decisions being made about industrial hygiene in an environment, or if there's an injury prevention situation going on, any type of meeting you might have, if you have suboptimal decisions every single time, and you're going to see suboptimal outcomes for patients, more exposures than you might otherwise see because you're making decisions that are not fully fleshed out in the right way. So it's an upstream indicator of these other issues that may be present in these other areas. So
thank you.
Following on the issue of meetings is germane for every single person because everybody's going to be involved in meetings, and trying to make those efficient and effective is very important. And we all have jobs to do in meetings. It's not just the manager of the meeting, it's everybody has a stake in good outcomes for meetings. And a department at U has 80 people and they have an all-day retreat, which is basically a large meeting. What is the cost of that meeting? Meetings are the most expensive time. What's the cost approximately? I guess.
$750K.
We got 10K here. $250,000.
Oh.
250, at least $250,000 lost opportunity costs. The reason I'm pointing that out is people always undervalue the time, but when you start multiplying everybody's time, you got to talk about their top dollar value. Meetings are the most expensive time of the entire day. So it's really sad when people sit there and twiddle thumbs the whole time. You got to be done.
Thank you.
can I add one more thing as one of the authors of the study?
Yeah, please.
So oftentimes, I think Barry likes to point at Dr. Allen said he complains about every article. This is actually a very terrible study.
Oh.
Among the studies that I've done, it's actually pretty awful. There's a reason it's in the International Journal of Management Practice. Okay, it's really quite bad. The sample's not very strong. The measures are actually good. I mean, that's why I defended the personality thing, because the measures are actually pretty good. Sample's not very good. Because it's not representative of a single industry, and it's actually skewed quite dramatically towards lower income, lower workers, lower wage workers, that sort of thing. The redeeming aspects of this are actually in the future work that was done, right? So what's funny about this is that when I got it published, like, okay. But future work that has been done not only by myself, but others who found it somehow, really confirmed these findings in other industries in much better representative samples, right? So I feel good about this paper because others proved that it was right. But at the time when I published it, and I still feel to this day, it's not very good. It's, a good amount of window dressing went into making sure this got into a journal, and that student was able to get a publication, that sort of thing.
The inside joke is before you came in, we were talking about having somebody make that comment that it was a bucket of bulls.
Yeah. So anyway, I think, and I hope people weren't filtering too much. I think you're welcome to poke holes in the work that I do. I think other faculty, if you're represented in here, should be okay with that as well, because we know that our research isn't perfect, right? But we also know that there are meaningful, maybe incremental contributions to be made by all this research, right? So anyway, just put that out there.
I don't know if we're out of time for this paper or not, but the biggest relationship is the relationship between counterproductive meeting behaviors and the meeting effectiveness rating. So as a behavioral psychologist, I'm thinking the lever is not personality, it's the counterproductive meeting behaviors. And leaders role modeling those behaviors and teaching, training, or communicating expectations that we do or don't do certain things in meetings. But there's only one example of a counterproductive behavior in the paper. Do you know examples of other ones on that scale?
Yeah, so I had pulled out counterproductive meeting behaviors to include a whole list of things. This isn't comprehensive, but side conversations, dominating behavior, non-constructive criticism, and then I also kind of touched on the cyclic nature of it, how it builds on itself.
It's like an 18-item scale, though,
Yeah.
Joe, right? Is it?
Yeah, it's an 18-item scale.
Are
and
they
they're
all kind of
they're all
on those
different
themes?
behaviors, but
Oh.
you've identified 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a whole list. This journal probably didn't let us do an appendix or something like that, but it would have been nice to have the measure there, because it's a list of actual behaviors. And I do agree, I think it's because it was behaviorally anchored, that relationship is actually what's held out in the literature since then.
Okay.
The personality stuff, even though it's measured well, it didn't really hold out.
Gotcha. Yeah, I thought the description of it wasn't, I mean, it's a great study, but I thought the description of it didn't make a ton of sense in terms of the non-significant findings. They really hammered on the idea that those folks were more internally focused, but I didn't really understand that. So,
All right, with that is time.
thanks.
Mr. Madison has some time. Thank you, Mike.
Yes. Oh yeah, I forgot about that there. One thing at a time. Thanks, bro.
Do you have any idea how I can get that set up, professional audio and audio settings, setting up? That's up there. Ready? And you put that on and then that. Shoot. Sweet, let's do that. Right, now it's peace. Okay. Yeah, I want to tell you the big bucks.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Perfect. And down, down. Wait, how do I use this?
The clicker, the down, arrow forward.
Where do I hold it?
Actually, it doesn't work.
Okay. Well,
Does the enter button
could someone please help me?
Zoom instead of do it like that, or enter.
Enter works.
Yeah, or back and forth.
back and forth.
That's easier.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. Hello, I am Madison. And I did my journal club presentation on houseplants, specifically this journal, titled Enhancing Mixed Toluene and Formaldehyde Pollutant Removal by Zamioculcas semifolia, combined with Sansevieria trifasciata and its CO2 emission. Now, those two botanical Latin words are kind of a handful. So throughout the rest of the presentation, I will be referring to the Zamioculcas semifolia as the ZZ plant. Very creative. It is the common name for this plant right here. And then the Sansevieria trifascia is also known as the snake plant. And these are my plants from home. I love them dearly. Another common name for the snake plant, because it looks like a snake, is mother-in-law's tongue. So very creative names. By raise of hand, who here is familiar with plants or photosynthesis? Kind of, sorta. Okay, so this might be some new information for all of us. To go over a little bit of background, VOC stands for volatile organic compound. It's what the study wanted to look at. It is harmful chemicals in the air. And the EPA found that the concentration of VOCs indoors is 5 to 10 times higher than the VOC concentration outdoors. So primarily this would affect workers working inside, like office workers, or I guess anyone inside manufacturing, as opposed to workers outside. And toluene and formaldehyde were the two VOCs that this study primarily looked at. Formaldehyde is a known carcinogen, and they are frequently found indoors. Formaldehyde is also a polar compound, while toluene is a non-polar compound. And that's important. Who here knows that plants require light and day? All of us, kind of. So if you leave like a grow light on your plant for like 24 hours, it's really harmful to the plant. And that is because of the way that it photosynthesizes. So going back to the chemicals in organic chemistry, this is formaldehyde, and it is a polar chemical due to the oxygen and how that works. Whereas toluene is a benzene with a methyl group, so it is a nonpolar chemical. And that is important because when we look at photosynthesis, there were two main ways that these plants break down the chemicals and make sugars. So the stomata is inside the plants, usually like in the leaves. But C3 plants, they, during the sunlight, open their stomata. This would be your basic plant. So trees, shrubs, a lot of the indoor plants, they work this way. They open the stomata, which allows CO2 to enter into the plant, and then it is put into the Calvin cycle, and it creates sugars. However, another way that plants can photosynthesize is during the night, they'll open their stomata, and the CO2 will come in, it'll be put into storage as a C4 carbon molecule, and then during the daytime, it'll transfer back to CO2 and put into the Calvin cycle and creates sugars. But during the sunlight, the stomata is closed, so it doesn't take in any more CO2. And this is because a lot of plants that are in very dry, hot places, like the desert, they want to keep as much water, moisture as they can. So they open their stomata during the night when temperatures are a little bit cooler, as to not give off as much water. Think of like pineapples, ZZ plant, cacti, your very dry desert-like plants. I did ask ChatGPT, how does CAM work in plants? I was very interested to see how this worked because I read online, but ChatGPT is not always accurate with the answers. But I was pretty impressed with what it said. So it said that it is photosynthesize adaptation found in some plants. Basically, the stomata opening, unlike most plants that open their stomata during the day to take in carbon dioxide, CAM plants open theirs at night, which helps to reduce water loss during the hotter daytime hours. CO2 uptake at night. CAM plants absorb CO2 in the atmosphere, which is fixed to a 4-carbon compound, typically malate, and stored in vacuoles. Daytime. During the day, the stomata close to conserve water. The stored malate is then converted back to CO2 for use in the Calvin cycle, allowing the plant to continue photosynthesis without needing to take in CO2 from the air. And it helps to minimize water loss, and it helps plants to survive in dry conditions. So I was pretty impressed with how GPT summarized this very complex way that some plants photosynthesize. So the research study, all of that was background. So the research study was looking at how the two plants will kind of filter out toluene and formaldehyde through phytoremediation. It's a very popular thing in the field, I guess. And how each one of them will individually do it and then combined. And then they also are concerned about the CO2 concentrations with the ZZ plant and snake plant during the day and during the night. The methods, so they took the leaf surface of each plant and reduced it to 260 square centimeters. You will notice that the ZZ plant has these lovely waxy leaves, whereas the snake plant, it's kind of just stem. It doesn't really have leaves. So they cut the stem so that it would be 260 centimeters squared to match that of the ZZ plant. They were both purchased new from a nursery and they were about the same age. Then the plants grew for a month indoors to avoid the plant stress of both cutting the leaves and moving it to a new condition so it could adjust. For combinations, they took 130 centimeters squared foliage from both the ZZ plant and the snake plant, put it into one pot to examine if it is synergistic with filtering out the air. Pots of each plant were covered with 3 layers of aluminum foil because they were concerned that maybe there's some microbes in the soil that would help, and they wanted to look at exactly just the leaves, the stem, the stomata versus the bacteria maybe in the soil. And triplicates were used for each condition. They were put into gas chambers, sealed with parafilm and clips, and they used 20 ppm of gaseous toluene, formaldehyde, and then they had a 1-to-1 ratio of a mixture of both toluene and formaldehyde. They also had a control for pots without any plant with 3 layers of aluminum they put into the gas chamber as well. They did 6 cycles of 48 hours each. And then for the looking at just toluene or just formaldehyde, they did 3 cycles of 48 hours. And then after the cycles, they took the plant leaves from the ZZ plant and removed them to look at maybe the stem, how the stem uses or filters out formaldehyde. So they did another cycle without the leaves. The removal efficiency was they wanted to look at different parts of the plant, and it was subtracted from the whole plant in order to get the gaseous removed from the stomata. So gas chromatography, FID, was used to see how much of the chamber still had formaldehyde, or toluene after the experiment. Formaldehyde dehydrogenase is the enzyme that is found in plants that helps break down formaldehyde in plants. And so they did an assay to analyze how much formaldehyde dehydrogenase was still in the plants. And they did that by looking at how much NAD plus and NADH was present in the plants, because the enzyme uses NADH and NADH plus as an oxidizer. So if there was more of that present, then they knew that there was more formaldehyde dehydrogenase enzyme. The cuticle wax extraction was used for pollutant exposure experiments and quantification as well. And to look at carbon dioxide, the emission consumption of the ZZ plant and the snake plants was measured in ppm. The plants were placed in a glass chamber, which were also sealed. Readings were taken every 2 hours for 24 hours, and the CO2 emission was measured with and without formaldehyde stress. Control chambers were used in glass bottles for light and dark conditions, and there were triplicates of each. For the results, they found that the ZZ plant appeared to remove nonpolar pollutants, toluene, better than polar pollutants, while the snake plant removed both polar and nonpolar. Therefore, they thought the combination of the two would be synergistic in removing both polar and nonpolar pollutants out of the air. So you can see from the graph, yes, so this is the ZZ plant and removal of the toluene, and then this is removal of the formaldehyde. You can see that with, let's see, the ZZ plant up top, for each cycle, it was about 98% efficient at removing the toluene. With the formaldehyde, it dropped a little bit lower, and that is because of the polarity of formaldehyde. But you can see that the snake plant did much better. See that next. In the case of mixed pollutants, so this graph looks at the pot that had both the ZZ plant and the snake plant. For the mixed. The combined plants successfully moved more than 95% of gaseous toluene over 6 consecutive cycles. They removed significantly more toluene than individual plants could have. And then when they looked at what part of the plant was removing a lot of the toluene and formaldehyde, they found that for the ZZ plant, these 4, it was mostly the stomata that, not the ZZ plant, sorry, the snake plant. The stomata was the part of the plant that was taking in a lot of the formaldehyde and toluene, whereas it's also the stomata over here, but for formaldehyde, wax, the wax cuticles, was also a huge benefit, a huge part of that. And they hypothesized that that is because formaldehyde is more toxic, and so it created physiological stress, which could have led to closure of the stomata, meaning that now the waxes, the cuticle waxes, would have to absorb the formaldehyde. And then when they looked at the formaldehyde dehydrogenase enzyme, they found that it increased in time, which is good because it shows that it was present and that the formaldehyde was being taken into the plant and transferred and broken down. So for conclusions, they found that both plants eradicated the pollutants mostly through the stomata pathway. Formaldehyde dehydrogenase activity was increased when plants were exposed to formaldehyde. So it kind of triggered it to have more FDH. The activity of FDH was found to be higher in the snake plant compared with the ZZ plant. And the pot with the combination of the two plants was found to be efficient in reducing the overall CO2 concentration. Both plant species were observed to produce more CO2 when exposed to formaldehyde and toluene. Do we have any questions, or what thoughts do you have on the study? I know it's not perfect and I know I'm not an expert, but I'm interested to see what you say. Bye-bye.
I've got a question from online, from Mallory. Did the authors mention if the plants were observed to have any physical differences in appearances from before and after?
They didn't really mention a lot of the physical appearances. Most of it was molecularly through the leaves, the stem with the cuticle waxes. Yeah, they didn't talk about how the plant really broke down or lack thereof. Yes.
I do a little bit of nature exposure research.
Oh, cool.
But like in the workplace and how that relates to like job outcomes. But I'm curious if there was any, I didn't see it in here, but I just read it.
Oh, sure.
But was there any recommendation for like how much space, like just one plant of each can clean? So like if I were to go to an organization and say these plants clean the air from these two things, but it's by a certain square footage, so then I can give a recommendation about how many plants they would need to buy.
Ooh, yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, I agree that the study didn't really talk about that. They were more concerned if it filters or not. But I think that would be a good place to continue the research, further research.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Another comment online, or question from Bethany Day. Since samples were stored in glass, do you think the change of light behavior could have impacted the results?
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And they didn't really say whether or not they like covered the glass with some sort of aluminum to prevent it from being affected through night or day cycles. That would have been a nice little bit of information to include.
Yeah, that was my question is where was the gas chamber? Where was the chamber where they were heaping the plants? Was it in a lighted space with natural light coming in that they would, respond to or not? Was it done at the same time? So within the same couple of weeks, so that way the amount of light would be the same? Or did they do this one and then 6 months later, middle of winter, they do?
When the light varies.
But those are the kinds of, control factors that I think they didn't say anything about. They probably did it because that would make sense. But then again, we don't have indication that they did control for those things. So.
Right. And I don't know if it's like just kind of with the fields, kind of a thing that you don't really say that you always do, but
yeah, yep. And there's plenty of those across different, fields. So, yep.
Bubba.
Another question from online along those lines. Do you know if the gas chambers were surveyed for existing chemicals before introducing the gases, or was it assumed to have clean air at the start?
That's a good question. I want to say they looked at it, but I don't remember exactly if they did. Yeah.
So we might need our industrial hygiene colleagues in the room to comment on this, but I'm just thinking you wouldn't want plants to be your primary hazard control. However, I'm thinking of workplaces where there may be consistent formaldehyde in the environment. I'm guessing nail salons would have all sorts of terrible chemicals.
Like paint thinners.
It feels like they could play a meaningful role in some types of workplaces, maybe even chemistry labs where there's sort of a chronic level, but I don't know if anyone knows, like nail salons, is that toxic smell and the salon's comprised of formaldehyde a little bit, or?
I'm sure it's there a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a very common VOC to find indoors. And I was reading up through some of the, I don't know, other research, and they talk about how it's in addition to other control factors. So like you were saying, it's not like the sole thing to depend on. And it is in addition. And a lot of places are like incorporating phytoremediation walls. So when air is intook, it's kind of going through this filter before it goes through another ventilation process.
It's super cool that they're metabolizing terrible stuff out of the air.
Yeah, and it's kind of a green look at it, I guess. And they're pretty to look at. They make me feel better. Yeah.
Along those lines, Barry just commented online, noting that there is also a very strong correlation between greenery in an office and overall better mental health. So just a better
Yeah.
vibes.
Yeah, better vibes.
Barry knows his stuff.
Yes, question.
Comment on the cutting process. Like we wanted the surface areas to be comparable between the two plants.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think about how you would even do that as a process. Like how do you measure the surface area of a leaf? I can think of some poor ways of doing that. And there's different densities of pores, there's different growth rates. Like, do you really think that?
Yeah, it's not really apples to apples. They did say that they had like a translucent grid of 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, and they would measure that to cut around, but it's not ideal. Yeah, I would agree.
I don't remember them saying why they chose those two plants and not, because there's a variety of different indoor type plants. In fact, I don't have either of those in my house, but I have lots of other plants in my house. And so I just wonder if they had any justification for why these two plants and not some other set of plants.
Yeah, so I looked at a lot of different studies with different plants.
Oh,
And I picked this one because I actually have these two plants.
okay.
But there's a lot of studies on the different plant types.
Okay.
I saw anything from a palm species, to like a spider plant, to some other plants that like I don't personally have. But I think this research study picked two plants that are common, to have indoors. I also know that they are out of Thailand, and the ZZ plant is native to Thailand,
Okay.
which I don't know if that's just because it was popular, like they chose it because it's popular and it's native, or because it was just easy to get. But they also wanted to look at how, because there is a history in the research of the ZZ plant being able to take the polar compounds, VOCs, whereas there was a little bit more of a research for this to take the non-polar compounds. So the study was like, if we combine the two, will it be synergistic in taking both polar and non-polar compounds out of the air? But yeah, I think they just picked two very common indoor plants that you see.
I think the snake plant has been studied by NASA.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So NASA did a study in 1989, looking at like 15 to 20 different plants, and they were interested to see how it filtered out the air. And they found that, I mean, you can look this all up. They found that each plant takes out X amount of chemicals out of the air and the percentages. And that was kind of the jumping off point for this field of phytoremediation is, well, can we replicate that? Can we disprove it? Where can we go with this? What does this look like? So that's where a lot of the beginnings of these research studies started.
Cool.
Any other questions?
The question that you may don't know the answer. Which plant's best? Not out of these two.
Depends.
Yeah.
I guess depends on what you're thinking. Yeah. I mean, I like that this one's called the mother-in-law's tongue. I think that's very fun. But I also really think this one's pretty. And they grow similarly in that they're stalks. So instead of like new growth coming out of the end of the stalks, new stalks will just start shooting up. That's going to be taller and taller. I think that's kind of fun. And the ZZ or the snake plant also kind of grows in a similar way. So I just think they're fun plants to have.
Yeah.
Anything else? See y'all next Friday unless you got Flash Drill Club, in which case see you next Tuesday.